Long before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, conflict was already simmering on Europe's borders. And according to the journalist Lucinda Smith, we ignore those disputes at our own peril. I'm Caitlin Allen, commissioning editor at Engelsberg Ideas, and I'm delighted to be joined by Hannah today. She's a foreign correspondent for The Times and The Atlantic, among others, and the author of a new book, Hinterlands, Journeys Across Europe's Unfinished Frontiers. Hannah, welcome to the EI podcast.
Thank you.
Now, you cover considerable terrain in this book, from Cyprus to Bosnia to Transnistria and beyond. Why did you decide to write Hinterlands now? And perhaps you can explain, in the context of this book, what exactly you mean by a hinterland.
Sure. Well, book ideas kind of come to me very, very slowly. I'm not somebody who sits down, has an idea for a book and then goes and kind of researches and writes it. What I like to do, because I'm a journalist, is go out and just do my job, reporting, looking at what's going on in various places, and then every few years to kind of sit back and take stock and see what threads I can pull from it, what kind of narratives, what bigger pictures going on. So the places that I refer to as hinterlands in the book are, like you say, very diverse on the map, but they share some things in common, principally that they're all kind of liminal places in that they are either unrecognised territories, occupied territories, or disputed territories around Europe. And I started visiting them principally because a lot of them are just very, very interesting. And were also magnets, not just for journalists, but also for tourists for a long time. So the place that I start the book in, which is a place called Nagorno-Karabakh in the Caucasus, it's been a frozen conflict since the 1990s. It was part of the Soviet Union. When that empire broke down, it was kind of pulled between two emerging nation states, which was Armenia and Azerbaijan, ended up as an unrecognised quasi-state. But because of this status was sort of marketed by boutique tour companies, you'd go to the place that doesn't exist, see ghost towns. These ghost towns actually were places that people were living until the early 1990s. Again, Cyprus, the northern part of Cyprus. In Cyprus, you have Europe's last divided capital in Nicosia. In the northern part of the island, you have what is called by itself the Turkish Republic of North Cyprus. Again, a quasi-state recognised only by Turkey. It's a very sort of jarring experience to walk from one side of Cyprus to the other. So when I was based in Istanbul, as I was for 13 years, these were all places that were very easy and quite cheap to get to and very, very interesting. So that's why I started initially. It was in the second half of the 2010s that I began realising that I was seeing themes emerging and seeing a bigger picture emerging, which was how these places had gone from being sort of held in stasis to, again, becoming central to the broader geopolitical story, which certainly from 2022 onwards and the invasion of Ukraine was the kind of competition between Russia and the West in Europe. But actually, that had been going on for a long time. The argument that I make in the book is that it really started in 2011 with the start of the revolution in Syria.
Yeah, and your first chapter is on Syria, but obviously this is a slight outlier when it comes to your definition of a hinterland. So why did Syria feel like an appropriate place to start? And perhaps you can explain this rather arresting parallel you draw between Damascus in 2011 and Sarajevo in 1914.
Sure. I think when we look at paper maps, right, they give us a certain sense of surety about the world. Borders are here. This country is here. Actually, a map is kind of it's not entirely an imaginary object. Of course, these borders exist on the ground. But when you go to a lot of places, the map doesn't represent them exactly in the way that they actually are on the ground. And I think this is very, very, very true of Europe. As Europeans, we tend to look at the map and say, okay, the edge of Europe falls here between, Greece and Turkey or in the Mediterranean. Actually, when you look at reality, what happens sort of on the edge of that region or outside that region really, really affects Europe. And we've seen that, emanating from Syria over the past 15 years, particularly in, for example, the refugee crisis. This was a moment where we came face to face with the reality that we might have a border on a map, but in reality, what is that border? For those refugees, it was a case of a journey of a couple of kilometres over the Aegean Sea from Turkey to Greece. We saw it also with the spread of ideologies. The way that what was happening in Syria, and particularly with the rise of extremist groups like ISIS there, blew back into Europe and radicalised tens of thousands of young people living in London, in Paris, in Berlin, in Brussels, sort of spurred them to go and join that war in Syria, again, by crossing through borders which look very definite on a map, are kind of porous. So that's why, I think that Syria, although we like to think of it as a place that's very, very far away, is actually very central to the modern European story and what's going on today. And, if you look, its distance to Cyprus, another one, the Hinterlands, is, only 100 miles or so across the sea. It's incredibly close. The other reason why I started the book there, so I ended up in Istanbul by way of Syria. I was covering the Arab Spring. I was in Damascus for the first protests of the revolution there in 2011. And I ended up living initially in Turkey in a place called Antakya, which is on the Syrian border, and going in and out and reporting in the Syrian conflict. But what I saw over that very, very long war, a generational war, is how it had really sparked things which changed the entire security paradigm in Europe and eventually led to what happened in 2022. Principally, this was the place where we saw for the first time, overtly, Russia and Iran, but I would say most importantly Russia, facing off against the West on a battlefield. This was not just a civil war, it was a proxy war. It became so very quickly. On Bashar al-Assad's side, Russia and Iran coming in behind him militarily, also supporting him through continuing trade. One of the weapons that the West tried to use against Assad all throughout the war was sanctions. And sanctions only work so far in as, everyone's willing to abide by them. And of course, we saw that was not the case. Again, with the refugee movement, that had profound impacts on the European Union and on Europe's idea of itself. Also exposed all kinds of, weaknesses and fractures within the European Union, emboldened leaders like Viktor Orban in Hungary, who really took on the kind of anti-migrant rhetoric and used it for his own populist ends. So I think, if you want to understand what is happening now on Europe's eastern flank, and what increasingly is also happening in the heartlands of Europe as well. I mean, we are increasingly aware of the way that hybrid warfare is playing out on our continent through things like, drone attacks or cyber attacks. Things often that we can't exactly pin on an adversary, but the suspicion is there that they were behind it. That's a new kind of hybrid warfare. And I think we can trace so much of this back to what happened in Syria.
And you mentioned Russian involvement in Syria. And of course, a central theme of your book is how both Russia and Turkey are vying for influence in all of these contested European borderlands that you visit. But as you point out, they have slightly different, or Erdogan and Putin are both skillful soft power players, but have slightly different cards to play. Turkey's being religion and Russia's being language. Could you talk a bit about how those cards offer them slightly different leverage?
Sure. I'll talk a little bit first about this very sort of quite hard to grasp relationship between Turkey and Russia. I think just like maps sort of offers some kind of false surety about the way the world is, also being in the European paradigm gives us this false idea that the way that the world runs is through, surety in institutions and, fixed policies and fixed relationships. Actually, in the kind of new world that's increasingly emerging, I would say we're sort of moving away from, the post-1945 paradigm. It was pretty much not a unipolar world, but a world that had very few big powers directing things. We're moving into this far more unsure era where states like Turkey, and to a lesser degree Russia, have made themselves very, very flexible in the way that they do politics and alliances. So you see with Turkey, it's a NATO member. For a long time, it looked like it was on the doorstep of the EU. That's kind of out the water. Tayyip Erdogan, the president, at the same time, is incredibly autocratic. There's almost no democracy or pluralism left in Turkey at all. Has also built this friendship with Vladimir Putin, which has seen them sort of going to air shows together in Russia and eating ice cream for the cameras, right? And Turkey far more seriously purchasing Russian defence equipment. At the same time, they're adversaries on multiple battlefields. They were adversaries in Syria to the point that, there were incidents where Turkish soldiers were killed in Russian bombings. They were adversaries in the Caucasus, in Nagorno-Karabakh, also in Libya. And yet also able to work together behind the scenes to achieve kind of mutual aims. I mean, clearly the fall of Bashar al-Assad in 2024 in Syria was largely down to the fact that Russia did not step in to save him. And it's very clear that there were discussions that had gone on behind the scenes in the lead up to that. Similarly, because of the way that he has played politics, even though NATO and Western countries might not have liked it over the past 10 years, that's allowed Tayyip Erdogan to present himself as a mediator in Ukraine to bring those two sides together. So, yeah, we've moved into this world where these powers are far more pragmatic, far more transactional in the way that they do politics and in the way particularly that they do foreign policy.
Yeah, it's interesting reading your book how, as you say, these two men managed to maintain fairly amicable relationships, and you point out some striking similarities between them. And yet, more and more of these places that you visit, we see that they have pretty opposing interests, or often supporting opposing sides in these conflicts. But I know that there is a point in the book where you say that it's important to remember that Russia has the upper hand in this relationship. Could you elaborate on what you mean by that?
Yeah, I think definitely for a very long time it did. If you go back, it's interesting, I think, to go back to the roots of the current relationship between, I was going to say Turkey and Russia, but actually probably more accurately Putin and Erdogan, because this is a relationship based on those kind of personalities very squarely. It dates back to late 2015, when it was far more of a kind of simplistic relationship of antagonism in Syria between the two. And in November 2015, a Russian fighter jet, which was on a bombing raid in northern Syria, according to the Turks, breached Turkish territory, airspace. According to the Russians, it didn't. It stayed within the Syrian borders. But ultimately, that jet was shot down by the Turks. And that sparked, as you can imagine, a huge diplomatic incident. Putin was furious. He imposed all kinds of economic embargoes on Turkey over that summer. The summer that followed, Russian tourists, charter flights were stopped. Russian tourists are the biggest tourist group in Turkey, so that's a major thing for Turkey. And it really, really battered Turkey's economy at a time when it was already undergoing some strains because of the war in Syria and the various terrorist attacks in Turkey. So eventually I believe it was late June 2016, the two leaders come to an accommodation and they restore their diplomatic ties. Pretty soon after that, there was the coup attempt in Turkey, which President Erdogan put down bloodily and with then huge consequences for years after. And Putin was I think he was the first leader to come and offer his support to Erdogan. And that was the moment that marked the start of this very, very close personal relationship. In the sort of years after that, we saw, that relationship being buoyed with constant visits between the two. It was usually Erdogan going to Sochi or to Moscow, to that purchase of the Russian S-400 missile defense system. And actually, a lot of these things were causing problems for Erdogan. He was constantly being berated, by other Western leaders. Turkey was kicked out of NATO's new generation fighter jet program as a result. There were sanctions. But for Putin, it was great, because what it did was it created this constant debate and sort of angst at the heart of NATO that really kept the alliance sort of distracted for many years. All these discussions constantly about, will Turkey leave NATO? Will Turkey be kicked out of NATO? And again, as I mentioned before, there were points during this period where Turkish soldiers were being killed by Russian fighter jets in Syria. And it was suppressed in the Turkish press. There was nothing said about it. These were all the signs that there were things that were not going Turkey's way in that relationship. However, there were also benefits, particularly when it came to the invasion of Ukraine, because then the sanctions that were already on Russia really kind of strengthened. It became almost impossible for particularly people linked to the Kremlin to do business in Europe. Turkey provided a useful backdoor. It didn't put sanctions on Russia immediately. Even in Istanbul, I remember seeing Medvedev's yacht come and dock in one of the Istanbul marinas because all the oligarchs had to flee from the European ports. So I think that was a tipping point, and I do think there was another tipping point came in 2024 with the fall of Assad. That has reshifted the power balance. So I think I wouldn't say now as strongly that it's a relationship where Putin holds the entire balance of power. I do think that's shifted. But of course, by nature of Russia's size, its military strength, its economic strength and natural resources, although of course its economy is being tested, it still is, by far the bigger partner to Turkey. And, they do operate in the same sort of field of competition. The Black Sea, for example, has always been a theatre of competition between Turkey and Russia.
I want to also ask you about the people living in the hinterlands, because it is as much a book about them as it is about an attempt to analyse wider geopolitical trends. Perhaps you can tell us about the widow you meet in Cyprus and what her story reveals about the legal complexities of living in a grey zone.
Yeah, I think one really important thing to remember whenever you're studying, anywhere actually, but particularly places which are sort of on the front lines or the fractures of geopolitics, is that the people living there, on the whole, just want to get on with their lives, right? In an ideal society, politics is kind of secondary to all the other far more enjoyable things. And, this is, unfortunately for the people who live in, disputed places or unrecognised places, politics plays a far bigger role in their life than often they would like. So, yeah, in northern Cyprus, I met a lady called Sevilay Kasapoğlu. She's a Turkish Cypriot. She lives in a place called Beyamurdur, which is a village which is not only right on the line between North and South Cyprus, but it also sits in one of two sovereign base areas. So these are the areas which are British military bases, and they're still actually British sovereign territory. So when you go into these places, it's bizarre because they sort of look like little versions of suburban England. There's kind of like cul-de-sacs and corner shops and, Walker's crisps and Cadbury's chocolate everywhere. And they're home not only to British soldiers, but also to local people as well. So these areas they're really big, actually, particularly the one, Decalia, that she lives close to. There's a lot of people farming there, living normal lives. Her husband, Tamer, was he was a cleaner on the base. So he basically was employed by the Ministry of Defence for many, many years, doing his job there. When he died, because the village is split between all these lines, obviously when the village was founded, Cyprus was just an island. These islands didn't exist. So actually the village cemetery falls on the Greek Cypriot side. Also, as a widow, she's entitled to his pension. But in order to get that, there's a bit of a web of bureaucracy that she has to go through. It's a bureaucratic place anyway, but it's made worse by the fact that where he worked was also considered the Republic of Cyprus, the Greek-speaking side. Northern Cyprus, where they live, is not recognised by anybody, including the British government, even though they're employing people who come from there. And so in order to pay his pension, it has to be paid to the Greek side. And then for the Greek side to recognise Sevilai as the widow and the rightful recipient, she has to go and live on the other side because they don't recognise her marriage certificate because it comes from the northern side. And according to them, the north doesn't exist and all its institutions don't exist. So this poor lady, having already, lost her husband, already having to travel through a border to even go and visit his grave, which is in the same village, also was presented with this ridiculous rigmarole of bureaucracy simply for the misfortune of being from a village which happened to fall right on the borderline of these hinterlands.
Another theme, actually, that struck me reading your book, and I think you actually used the phrase held in stasis earlier, but this theme of places that appear to be frozen in time. So in Transnistria, you write that time stood still. And then in Cyprus, you talk about these no-go areas that act as a time portal. And then in Syria, actually, there's this quite vivid anecdote of this pair of children's tractor pajamas still hanging in the Turkish embassy, belonging to the former ambassador's son, who's now in his mid-20s. Perhaps you can talk a bit more about why time warps are a motive of the hinterlands.
Yeah, sure. So by the nature of these places, when they become inaccessible, either for people, for finance, investment, trade, it sort of locks them in a certain point in time. In Cyprus, what you're referring to is the Green Line. So this is the line of division between the Republic of Cyprus and the north. And it's not just a line, it's actually a sort of buffer zone. So it cuts right across the island. You've got soldiers on either side sort of facing off against each other. You've got border crossings on either side. If you have a British passport or a European passport, it's very easy to cross through it at the border crossings. But you're sort of hurried through. You can't stay within the Green Line. It's patrolled actually by British soldiers on UN missions. And there are whole buildings, sometimes nearly whole villages, trapped in between. There's the entire old Cyprus airport, which is and there's still a jumbo jet on the runway. There is a hotel called the Ledra Palace, which used to be the kind of finest hotel in Cyprus. It's bang in the middle in this sort of no man's land. It was housing British troops for a really long time, and then they started complaining about the conditions there because it was no longer the kind of grandest accommodation on the island. It really deteriorated. I've never been fortunate enough to go and have a tour in the bit of the Green Line that goes through the capital, Nicosia, because there it's like literally a slice of the old capital. There's a few streets and it's, I've seen pictures of it. It's car showrooms that still have cars from the 1970s in them. It's now got too dangerous. Unfortunately, there used to be sort of occasional tours of diplomats and journalists were taken in there. But in other places, it's more about kind of, lack of investment. So the rest of North Cyprus, for example, this is changing now, but for the longest time, compared to the south, it was delightful because the south turned into this absolute package holiday hotspot. Overdeveloped, huge hotels, concreted over, mass tourism. Whereas the north was like delightful. It was really undeveloped. And, I'd always recommend that people go to the north over the south. In other places, it's sort of almost self-consciously, literally stuck in time. So Transnistria is the prime example of this. Transnistria is part of Moldova, but since the 1990s, it's been, again, semi-autonomous. You have to go over a quasi-borders to get in. And it basically sort of didn't want to accept the fact that the Soviet Union was over. So it kept all its Lenin statues. It kept, its House of Soviets. It kept its KGB until about maybe a bit longer, maybe about 10 years ago. And that drew in a huge amount of tourists. What the sort of jollity of it overlooked was the fact that it was also a massive Russian weapons dump and home to a huge amount of Russian soldiers. And when 2022 happened, all of a sudden analysts were looking at Transnistria and seeing how close it was to Odessa. You could be in Odessa in a matter of hours, and suddenly it became a security problem.
Would you say, as much as this is a book about this new Cold War, would you say this is also a book in many respects about what happens when empires fall?
Yeah, and I think it's also a book about what happens when empires fall and what comes after isn't properly finished off. We haven't talked about the Balkans yet, but this is another region that I visited widely. Actually, over many years, it was the first region I worked in as a foreign correspondent 20 years ago. This is a place that, I mean, it was definitely a result of the end of the Cold War, but Yugoslavia obviously wasn't within the Soviet Union. It was a sort of separate socialist entity, a multi-ethnic federation. And after the death of its longtime leader, Josip Tito, broke down into ethnic conflict in the 1990s. The states that emerged as a result of that, there's 7 post-Yugoslav states. They all still have border disputes in some way or another. The 2 countries which saw the 2 bloodiest and most bitter wars, which are Bosnia and Kosovo, are the ones that are still the most fragile and unfinished. So in Bosnia, what you have, it's a country of about 3 million people. It's very, very small, but it's split within itself into broadly two entities. There's the Bosnia-Herzegovina Federation, which is largely Muslim Bosniaks and Croats living in Sarajevo and Mostar and the places around there. And then in the north, you have an entity called the Republika Srpska, which is Bosnian Serbs. The de facto capital is a place called Banja Luka, which, I mean, it's like a provincial town. I think it's about 300,000 people there. But it's got the parliament, it's got presidency, it's got stock exchange, all these things. And increasingly in recent years, the leader there has built ties with Vladimir Putin. They have Serbs in the Balkans and Russians have kind of deep historic ties based on their religion, Orthodox Christianity, the fact that they're Slavic, very, very deep sort of historical alliance. And Putin has really been kind of fanning the sentiment of separatism in the Republika Srpska. It's led to, increasingly loud declarations from a guy called Milorad Dodik. He's basically been in charge of Republika Srpska since the late 90s. He's going to secede from federal Bosnia, go it on his own, possibly seek a union with Serbia, although I don't think that's something that Serbia would want. And that's incredibly dangerous because you start looking at kind of border changes in Bosnia and it can set off a chain reaction across the Balkans. So this is what happens when empires fall or when confederations fall and new countries are formed. It's rarely easy and peaceful. It's usually extremely traumatic. But when those borders and new states are not fully finished, as they often aren't, for very good reasons. I mean, in the case of Bosnia, the reason why it ended up like that is because it was a result of the Dayton Accords, which ended the fighting in 1995. Nobody can argue with the fact that it was a very good thing that war ended and largely remained at peace since. But it did leave this sort of very fragile political situation, which is just kind of open to meddling from outside and pressure from within as well.
And why is it that it's necessarily Putin who benefits from chaos in these former Yugoslav countries?
It's really, really useful for Putin to be able to do things which are sort of on the borderline of deniable. Again, I mean, this comes back to the sort of, hybrid attacks we've been seeing over the past few years in Europe. Things like explosion at DHL depots, electricity outages, things like that. It's always just deniable. And it's also a very, very low cost and low risk way to bring some sort of chaos or instability right into the heart of Europe. The Balkans, when you look on the map, you realise how close it is actually to the centre of Europe. This is not a peripheral region. You could be in Sarajevo probably in a day driving from Vienna. Definitely you could be in Belgrade within a few hours. And any kind of sense of newly rising tension in that region is going to distract the EU. It's going to distract NATO. You know, one of the really, really poignant things that stayed with me as I was writing this book, I was speaking with an analyst in Bosnia, and he said, we think that if the Russian troops had reached Kiev in February 2022, that war would have broken out in Bosnia the next day, that Milorad Dodik in the Republika Srpska would have been fully empowered and fully backed by Putin to open up a second crisis on the EU's doorstep. And can you imagine, I mean, the amount of attention and money and loss of life that's already happened in Ukraine. Now imagine that another war was going on. This is why it's incredibly useful for Putin to have these regions where he does project influence and can create chaos, possibly even conflict, with really not much effort at all.
I know there's also this very forthright conversation with a European diplomat that you recount in the book, who tells you if Russia were to invade the Baltics tomorrow, there is not a thing that Europe can do. Article 5 is dead. Now, this is perhaps a difficult question for you to answer, but I wonder if you think this is alarmist or if writing this book has brought you to a somewhat similar conclusion yourself.
I really hope not. I definitely hope not. I mean, I guess we have to take it in the context of a diplomat talking to a journalist, right? This was actually a lunch in Istanbul that several of us have been asked to attend. So clearly the diplomat had a message that he wanted to give, and that was his message. You know, what I always find interesting when sort of reporting on NATO is you get sort of two quite different versions of events, whether you speak to politicians or whether you speak to the military people. Military people always, even in, you know, the sort of the height of Turkey seeming to cozy up to Russia and buy its defence equipment, always the military people in NATO would say, oh, no, look, these are political disputes. On a military level, we're all united. You go to the politicians and they tell you something a bit different. I suspect the answer lies somewhere between the two. This is the question for NATO, I think. At what point is an attack considered an attack? Because I think when, you know, the NATO was conceived and Article 5 was written, it was quite clear what an attack was, right? It was one country's army going to another country and attacking it, invading it. Now, okay, let's talk about, for example, if there was an attack on a pipeline or on an internet cable on the UK that shut off all our internet for a couple of days, we would descend into chaos pretty quickly without internet for all kinds of reasons. Is that an attack? Should that trigger Article 5? I think these are the really difficult questions that NATO is grappling with. And I think this is the more kind of salient thing to think about when we think is Article 5 dead, because already there are things happening on Europe's kind of eastern flank that could feasibly be seen as attacks. You know, if you have drones going into buildings in Romania, or it was in Germany, wasn't it, the other week, where by chance one was found and it was carrying explosives. You know, is that Article 5? So I think this is the crisis that NATO faces, actually. And also in how do you, once you've sort of settled on what an attack is, how do you get all the members to agree with you? Because you have some members that are far more enthusiastic than others.
I know, of course, it's very difficult to predict our geopolitical future, and even with Syria, the fall of Assad might have been predicted time and again, but the exact timing of it certainly caught many of us off guard. But obviously you make a compelling case in Hinterlands that what is happening in these Europe's contested borderlands has implications for the continent as a whole and offers a glimpse of future struggles. So what do you see as the direction of travel, and are more democracies set to slide into forms of autocracy?
That's certainly been the pattern, not just recently, for the past 20 years, I think. We've seen a steady decline in democracy all over the world. We've seen backsliding in places like Turkey and Hungary. Of course, Hungary is a sort of one small reason for optimism. It shows that things can go sort of into reverse in a good way as well as a bad. But I do think, the general trend isn't great. We have all kinds of challenges to democracy that are not going away, not just in the sort of form of leaders like Putin or Erdogan, but also through, social media and the way that has changed the way that we talk about social issues here, right? The way that that's sort of made an opening for populists here to rise through the polls, to take seats in parliament. Then on a sort of, broader defence level, I think it is really quite clear that the war in Ukraine is not stopping. Again, I was one of the people who thought that Bashar al-Assad was there until he died. So, we can all be really wrong, and things can happen suddenly. But I think it's certainly the direction of travel. People are talking about, how soon will it be until Putin feels that he can attack a NATO ally openly. The talk here in the UK about, the sort of defence spending that we need to do. It does unfortunately feel like we are sort of rolling towards quite a serious security situation in Europe.
I think we will end on that troubling note. For all of those listening, Hannah's book, Hinterlands, Journeys Across Europe's Unfinished Frontiers, is out now, and it's an incredibly insightful and wide-ranging book. Hannah, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the EI podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please sign up to our mailing list and download the Engelsberg Ideas app. Explore intelligent perspectives on history, culture, and geopolitics anytime, anywhere. And best of all, it's totally free. Until next time, thanks for listening.